The gravel crunched beneath my tires in a way that felt wrong. Something was off. As my silver SUV made the final turn onto Maple Ridge Road, I expected the familiar view of home, the fields, the fence, the rhythm of memory. But what emerged from the horizon wasn't the farm I'd grown up on. It was gone. In its place stood a massive concrete structure, hulking and gray, where golden wheat had once danced in the breeze. Rows of gleaming windows stared back at me like unblinking eyes, reflecting the sky with a cold indifference. I pulled over, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale. My family's land, 4 generations of blood, sweat, and seasons, had vanished. What stood now was a sleek 3-story hotel. Trimmed hedges lined the parking lot. Lawns, too perfect to be real, wrapped around the base. Bright yellow construction tape marked the perimeter, and workers in hard hats moved with mechanical efficiency, like ants building a nest. I sat there stunned. How could this have happened? I'd only been away for a few weeks. A consulting gig in Singapore that was supposed to help keep us afloat. Sarah and I had planned everything down to the smallest detail. We thought we had secured the property. The farm wasn't just dirt and crops. It was sacred. Every acre had been loved and labored over. It was our legacy. A construction worker spotted me and walked over, clipboard tucked under his arm. "Can I help you?" he asked, cautious. I stepped out slowly, my legs unsteady. "This is my family's property," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm Richard Holloway." His expression faltered. "You're the owner?" He looked unsure what to say next. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Richard, emergency. Call me. ASAP." But I couldn't take my eyes off the structure that now stood where my wheat once grew. I took a few steps forward, each one heavy, my boots crunching over ground that no longer felt like mine. This wasn't a building, it was a message, an act of theft wrapped in modern architecture. Near the construction entrance, a sign caught my attention. Willowbrook Community Development, approved by HOA Board. And there, in bold letters, was a familiar name. Karen Reynolds, Project Director. A cold realization crept over me. Karen, the HOA president, the one who always complained about our fence line, our grass height, our tractor noise, the woman who treated our farm like it was a blemish on her suburban fantasy. She had always wanted this land, but this was war. Nearby, a stack of paperwork sat unattended. I drifted closer, compelled. Permits, zoning changes, approval forms, a bureaucratic trail of how our land had been stolen on paper. One document in particular raised red flags. A small footnote about community improvement zones. The phrasing was too neat, too clever. Not illegal maybe, but designed to deceive. The worker called out again, voice softer this time. "Sir, you're not supposed to be here." I glanced at him with a thin smile. "I won't be long." Back in my SUV, my mind was racing. How long had this been in motion? What legal tricks had Karen pulled? And how could I undo it? Sarah's message still sat unread, but I knew this was no longer just about land. It was about something bigger. Justice, legacy, truth. As I drove into town, a billboard loomed. Willowbrook, growing together. I let out a bitter laugh. Apparently, growing together meant taking without asking. I parked at a quiet cafe and pulled out my notebook. Dates, observations, questions. Each scribble was a step forward, a thread in the unraveling tapestry. The waitress refilled my cup. "Rough day." I looked up and managed a small, sharp smile. "No," I said. "It's just getting started." Delicate pencil strokes crisscrossed the old paper, outlining the precise borders of our farm. In the margins, my grandfather's handwriting, sharp, cramped, and filled with urgency, spoke from another time. I could almost hear his voice echoing in my mind. "Knowledge is your sharpest blade, son. Never forget that." I remembered his gnarled fingers pointing to these very maps, telling me how he fought to protect our land through droughts, debt, and dishonest men. As I combed through the documents, a pattern began to emerge. Subtle at first, then undeniable. The Homeowners Association hadn't appeared overnight. It had crept in, slowly and quietly over the years, chipping away at individual rights like termites hollowing out a beam. I found faded minutes from board meetings, curt letters to local landowners, informal notices wrapped in legalese that now read like threats in disguise. Then I found a worn yellow envelope buried beneath a stack of correspondence. Inside, a collection of letters told a forgotten story, an old land dispute eerily similar to my own. Decades ago, the HOA had tried to seize underused land under the banner of community enhancement. But someone back then had stopped them, and these pages revealed exactly how. I began photographing everything, my hands steady despite the fire building in my chest. Each snapshot captured a moment of history, a legal breadcrumb that Sarah would later help me piece together. She had an uncanny ability to see patterns others missed. I just hoped we still had time. The barn, which once smelled of old hay and sun-warmed wood, suddenly felt charged with energy. These weren't just relics anymore. They were weapons, evidence, proof. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel outside. I froze. Someone was here. In an instant, I shoved the documents back into their folders and slipped them beneath a tarp. My heart thudded as I peeked through the small window. A white SUV had stopped near the fence. HOA stickers glinted on the windshield, and out stepped Karen Reynolds. She moved with the smug confidence of someone who thought everything she saw already belonged to her. Her designer sunglasses reflected the sun, and her clipboard was clutched like a royal decree. She paced slowly, surveying my land, our land, like she was sizing it up for sale. Her heels sunk into the soil that had grown wheat just weeks before. I ducked back, silent, hidden in the shadows of the barn. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Marcus, my lawyer. Found something big. Call me ASAP. I didn't move. Not yet. I knew the game Karen was playing. One wrong move could be twisted into a narrative of uncooperative landowner. My grandfather always said patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And strategy was exactly what I needed. The past few days of research had opened up a web of connections I hadn't expected. HOA board members with ties to local developers, city council meetings that mysteriously favored projects like Karen's. Every connection was another stitch in a tightly woven cloak of corruption. Eventually, Karen returned to her car and drove off, leaving behind a haze of dust and the sting of her silent inspection. I waited 5 minutes, maybe more, before stepping outside. The farm didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. I needed more than emotion. I needed a case. The papers in my barn were just the beginning. Somewhere in those documents lay the key to unraveling Karen's land grab. I turned to look at the rising hotel in the distance. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The community center buzzed like a hornet's nest when I walked in, leather briefcase in hand. Inside were the documents I'd spent days assembling. Maps, deeds, photographs, records. Weapons in paper form. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the rows of plastic chairs. HOA board members sat in a half circle, like judges on a stage. The audience behind them consisted of curious locals, some supportive, others skeptical. At the head of the table sat Karen, every inch of her screaming control. Immaculate blazer, stiff posture, hair pulled back like armor. She was the kind of person who wore authority like perfume and expected you to smell it from across the room. I'd seen her in action before, cornering neighbors after meetings with a voice soaked in fake concern and veiled threats. But this time would be different. I'd like to speak about recent developments concerning my family's farmland, I said, keeping my tone even, deliberate. Silence followed. Conversations died mid-whisper. Tension crackled in the air. I approached the table and unrolled the first set of maps, aged, yellowed, and notarized. The kind of documents that spoke louder than any lawyer ever could. They showed every boundary, every easement, every agreement that had long predated the very existence of the HOA. My hand moved slowly over the faded lines, tracing not just borders, but generations of history and rights. Across the table, I saw Karen's expression tighten, a flicker, barely a twitch, but enough to tell me she knew. She was standing on shaky ground. These records, I continued, make it clear that the land where that hotel now stands could never have been legally transferred without my direct approval. Then came the photos, decades worth of images showing the land in active use, crop rotations, machinery, family events, all time-stamped, all proof of continuous occupation and care. From the back of the room, a woman leaned forward, Martha Thompson, a longtime resident known for her fairness. I caught her eyes scanning the documents. Her face shifted from curiosity to concern. Karen tried to interrupt. Mr. Holloway, I don't think this is the... I'm not finished, I said calmly but firmly. I had spent my life learning how to argue clearly, patiently. Now it was paying off. One by one, I dismantled their illusion of control, and I had just begun. Karen's eyebrow twitched, barely perceptible, just a fraction of a movement, but I caught it. That tiny tell said more than words ever could. She realized right then that she was on an unsteady ground. These documents, I continued evenly, prove that the hotel sitting on my family's land was never legally authorized, not without my explicit consent. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a carefully arranged series of photographs. One by one, I laid them on the table. Each image showed our farm through the years, crops rotating, fences maintained, tools in use, family members working the land, all time-stamped, all evidence. Each photo drove a nail into the coffin of the HOA's lies. In the back of the room, a woman leaned forward, squinting to get a better view. Martha Thompson. I remembered her as one of the more reasonable residents, fair-minded, quiet, but respected. Her eyes moved across the photos, her expression shifting from curiosity to something much deeper, concern. Karen's voice cut through the silence. Mr. Davis, this is hardly— I'm not finished, I interrupted, my tone calm but deliberate. Years of corporate consulting had taught me that silence is a weapon and interruptions are opportunities. Several board members shifted uneasily, no longer as confident as when the meeting began. I then revealed the next blow, one they weren't expecting. This, I said, unfolding a thick document, is a private environmental impact study I commissioned before any of this construction began. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as I handed out copies. It details critical oversights in the hotel's development, faulty drainage design, disruption of protected soil beds, and violations of county environmental policies. These aren't just claims, they're backed by certified geological assessments. Martha raised her hand. Could you explain what the drainage issues actually mean for the local ecosystem? Of course, I said, stepping closer to her side of the room. In simple terms, the hotel's runoff system could contaminate the water table. Over time, it could pollute local wells, kill vegetation, even erode nearby property. I spoke plainly, breaking the technical language down into what mattered, how it would hurt the community. People listened, really listened. I saw it in their posture, their eyes, the way pens moved across notepads. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her eyes darted, her lips tightened. She wasn't just losing control, she was watching the foundation of her authority start to crack. You don't get to take land just because you want to, I said softly, letting the words settle like dust. This isn't about a hotel. It's about rights. It's about honoring a family's legacy and the trust a community places in its institutions. From his seat near the end of the table, a younger board member, Justin, I recalled, leaned forward, hands clasped together. We have some questions, he said, about the documentation. I nodded slightly, a half smile forming. Questions were good. Questions meant the room was no longer on her side. For the next hour, I walked them through everything: old deeds, legal clauses, historical maps, municipal letters. The evidence was a mosaic, and each tile was clicking into place. I wasn't just fighting for acreage, I was defending a principle. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. The initial skepticism in the room had dissolved. Even the most rigid faces now looked unsettled. Justin was poring over the environmental documents with a thoughtful frown. Martha was jotting notes with purpose. Karen, she remained frozen, silent, her polished armor of confidence now barely concealing the panic beneath. I hadn't won, not yet, but I had planted something far more dangerous than accusations: doubt. And in a room like this, doubt grows fast. As people filed out, Martha caught up to me near the back door. These environmental findings, she whispered, her voice low. They're serious. I don't think the board really understood the scale of what's happening until now. I nodded as I gathered my papers. They will. Soon. Outside, long shadows stretched across the parking lot. My truck sat quietly under the fading sun, the dust on its hood reminding me of all that had been lost. But something was different now. This wasn't just about saving land anymore. It was about justice. Across the lot, I saw her, Karen. She stood by her car watching me, her eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw fear behind her stare. She knew I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, right after breakfast, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mr. Henderson, the elderly farmer from down the road. His hands trembled slightly as he held out a worn manila envelope. "You'll want to see this," he said, barely above a whisper. There was something in his voice, a gravity born from decades of silence. Inside the envelope was a time capsule. Faded photos, scribbled notes, yellowing documents, and buried within them, a narrative I hadn't expected, a pattern. Karen Reynolds hadn't just targeted my farm. This was something bigger, an orchestrated effort spanning years. land reclassifications, zoning technicalities, hush-hush developer deals, all cloaked under the banner of community improvement. As I studied the papers, Sarah came up beside me and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "What's running through your head?" she asked. "These," I said, laying the pages across the table. "These aren't just papers. They're the blueprint to her entire game." "These aren't just old records," I said, my voice low as I laid out the yellowed papers on the kitchen table. "They're a roadmap straight into Karen's mind." Mr. Henderson settled into the chair across from me, his eyes distant as if retracing the years. "She's been pulling strings like this for a long time," he murmured. "But no one ever had the guts to push back. Not really." I held up the first photograph from the folder he brought, an aerial shot of Willowbrook, dated somewhere in the late 1990s. Red lines outlined parcels of land, but something felt wrong. The boundaries didn't match the official county maps I'd been studying, not even close. "I remember when she took over the HOA," Mr. Henderson said quietly. "She promised to make the neighborhood better. But better for who?" Sarah had already begun making copies. Her movements were calm, focused, every page treated like a rare artifact. Each document was potential ammunition, each image a loaded weapon. I looked out the window just in time to catch a young woman passing by on the sidewalk. She paused in front of the house, eyes darting. Recognition hit me. She'd been at the last HOA meeting, sitting in the corner, silent but observant. Her gaze lingered on our home before she quickly turned and walked away. "Do you know her?" I asked. Sarah was already watching. "She's been by twice this week," she said softly. "Always looks like she wants to knock, but she never does." Mr. Henderson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's talk going around town. Not everyone supports what Karen's doing, but people are scared. She's got a reputation, makes life hell for anyone who speaks up." I spread out the documents again, this time arranging them by topic. Zoning changes, boundary edits, unexplained permits. A disturbing pattern emerged. Karen hadn't been acting impulsively. This was a calculated strategy, years in the making. "She's playing a long game," I said, tapping one of the redrawn boundary lines. "And our farm was just her latest move." "We can't move too fast," I told Sarah. "These papers give us power, but if we fumble, she'll twist the narrative and discredit everything." Just then the phone rang, a number we didn't recognize. Sarah answered, keeping her voice even. The call was short. She hung up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Someone wants to meet you," she said. "They know about Karen, about her past projects." Mr. Henderson's eyes sparkled. "Funny thing about the truth," he muttered. "It finds a way out, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it." We began placing each document into protective sleeves, organizing them into categories. Zoning, permits, historical boundaries, HOA correspondence. Decades of record-keeping that once seemed obsessive now felt prophetic. Karen believed she could do whatever she wanted, that no one would challenge her. But this time, she was wrong. As we worked, a car rolled slowly down the street. Through the window, I saw the same young woman from earlier. She didn't stop this time, just watched, waiting, maybe for a signal, maybe for the right moment. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We're in this together." I looked down at the files before us. These weren't just paper and ink. They were proof, evidence of theft disguised as improvement, of manipulation hidden behind HOA bylaws, and of one woman's belief that she stood above the law. We were going to fight. As Mr. Henderson stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Sometimes," he said with a tired smile, "the quietest people carry the loudest stories." Then as he turned to go, something slipped from his jacket, a folded page that fluttered to the floor, another puzzle piece waiting to be discovered. The next morning, the kitchen table looked like a war room. Maps, deeds, letters, layer upon layer of evidence. I stood at the center of it all, trying to draw meaning from the chaos, trying to understand where we stood and what came next. Marcus Thompson, our attorney, sat across from me, scanning a century-old property map through his reading glasses. He traced a slow path along the survey lines with his finger. "These boundaries are a mess," he muttered, more intrigued than frustrated, more complicated than I expected. I nodded, remembering how Karen used to sneer at us during HOA meetings, mocking our old tractors, our farming methods, our unpainted barn. Her French manicured fingers would tap impatiently on the table while we spoke, as if our very presence was an inconvenience. But those same rough hands she looked down on were about to dismantle her entire scheme. Sarah brought over fresh coffee, resting a hand on my shoulder before slipping away. That small gesture reminded me why this mattered, why we were fighting. This wasn't just about dirt, it was about roots. Marcus pulled out a stack of county records and laid them out beside the older map. "Look at this," he said, unfolding 3 property surveys, one from the 1950s, another from the 70s, and the last just before I left for Singapore. He lined them up. At first glance, they all told the same story, but as he adjusted them, something emerged. Tiny shifts in the boundary lines, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Yes, but there they were. "The HOA didn't do their homework," Marcus said, a slow smile creeping across his face. "They assumed no one would notice these discrepancies. They didn't count on my grandfather keeping everything," I added, "or on me coming back." Marcus leaned in, whispering with a sly grin beginning to stretch across his face. "They assumed this would be easy," he said. "But land disputes? They're never simple, especially not when someone actually pays attention." We spent the rest of the afternoon buried in paperwork. Property tax records, inheritance filings, even brittle correspondence between my grandfather and county officials, long gone. Each page was a tile in a mosaic we were piecing together, a hidden history woven into our family's soil. Then Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his eyes lighting up. "The Historical Society just got back to me," he said, voice rising slightly with excitement. "They've got archived land use documents, some dating all the way back to the 1940s. My thoughts drifted to Karen. I could see her perfectly manicured lawn, her pristine HOA newsletters, her posture as she walked the neighborhood like royalty surveying her domain. She always acted like she owned it all, but even kingdoms built on arrogance crumble. "We have to move carefully," Marcus warned, shifting back to strategy. "If they catch wind of what we're piecing together, they'll start erasing tracks." I nodded. This wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a delicate dance, and one misstep could cost everything. That's when Sarah stepped into the room holding a large, dust-covered box. "I found this in a crawl space behind your great-grandfather's filing cabinet," she said, placing it gently on the table. "I think it's important." The brass hinges creaked slightly as we opened the lid. Inside was a time capsule, meticulously preserved property surveys, land transfer records, faded legal documents, items most people would have discarded, but my grandmother hadn't, and now they might make all the difference. Marcus's eyes widened as he sifted through the contents. "These aren't just documents," he muttered. "These are game changers." Afternoon light poured in through the kitchen window, casting golden beams across the piles of old parchment. It almost felt spiritual. Each map was a battlefield, every signature a weapon. Karen had underestimated the quiet strength of this family, of this land. She thought she could erase us, but she hadn't counted on history fighting back. Then the phone rang. Marcus glanced at the screen. "County Records Office, Byron," he said. "They found something buried in the archives." I looked out the window toward the hotel's silhouette in the distance. It towered over the wheat fields like a monument to theft. But buried beneath that soil, beneath the glass and concrete, was something stronger than any structure they could build. Our truth, our defense. "They thought we'd roll over," I said. "That was their mistake." Marcus packed the documents carefully, sealing them in a weatherproof folder. As he stood, he looked at me with a quiet intensity. "We're not just fighting for your farm," he said. "We're fighting for what's right." As the sun dipped behind the horizon, a peaceful hush fell over the land. The hotel loomed like a shadow, but it no longer felt invincible. I stood in the doorway and breathed deeply. For the first time in weeks, there was something new in the air. Hope. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Something told me this call was about to change everything. The attic had always been a place of nostalgia, a sanctuary filled with forgotten toys and musty photo albums. But today it felt different, as if the air itself held its breath. Sunlight spilled in through the tiny round window, illuminating specks of dust that drifted like memory fragments. Sarah was crouched near the back wall, her hands carefully prying loose an old wooden box tucked behind a beam. "I've never seen this before," she said, brushing it off. The corners were frayed and the brass hinges bore the tarnish of time. She opened the lid slowly, reverently. Inside, neatly stacked layers of parchment and photographs formed a silent archive. Decades of correspondence, property deeds, annotated maps. My grandfather's handwriting, precise and deliberate, adorned nearly every margin. It was like opening a hidden diary written in legal ink and land coordinates. The first map we unfolded was unlike anything we'd seen. It wasn't just topographical, it was coded. Red lines zigzagged across the page, forming connections to neighboring plots in ways that implied a far more intricate network. Small, unfamiliar symbols dotted the corners, deliberate, intentional. almost like a personal cipher. Sarah leaned closer. These look like surveyor marks, but more deliberate, like there's a pattern. We kept digging. Every letter, every document painted a picture of a man who wasn't just a farmer. He was a strategist. My grandfather had documented everything, every meeting, every land adjustment, every handshake agreement with local officials. He hadn't just lived on this land. He had defended it from threats no one else even saw coming. Then I found it, a letter dated 1973. Its paper was yellowed and brittle, addressed to the county land registry, bearing my grandfather's signature. But the contents were unlike anything I expected. The letter referenced something I hadn't anticipated, an old land trust. But this wasn't just any legal arrangement. It was dense, arcane, the kind of mechanism modern attorneys might fumble through with confusion. This isn't a deed, I muttered, staring at the thick yellow document. It's a shield, a legal fortress. Sarah reached into the box again, pulling out a folded sheet. It was a hand-drawn family tree, but this one extended far beyond anyone I'd ever heard mentioned at reunions. Names unfamiliar to me were intricately connected by generations, by locations, by notes in my grandfather's tight script. It was more than genealogy. It was a map of strategic land ownership. At the very bottom of the box lay the most curious item of all, a sealed envelope. No name, no address, just a wax imprint, our family's initial pressed into deep red. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside, the letter was written in my grandfather's distinct handwriting, precise, powerful, and deliberate. He spoke of protections he'd built long ago, a legal mechanism that would activate under specific conditions, conditions that eerily mirrored exactly what we were now facing with the HOA. He had known, somehow he'd known. This wasn't a coincidence, I whispered. He saw this coming. But the letter didn't just talk about legal tools. It hinted at something deeper, a conflict that predated Karen, the HOA, even modern zoning laws. There was talk of land rights, political favors, failed community development schemes, a quiet battle that had been simmering long before we ever realized it existed. Sarah noticed the change in my face. "What is it?" she asked. I looked up slowly. "These documents, they aren't just to protect our farm. They could expose something much, much bigger." A shuffle of paper drew our attention. A stack of photos slipped from inside one of the folders. Black and white aerial shots of Willowbrook, spanning decades. Subtle changes appeared when you compared them side by side. Shifts in boundaries, adjustments that would have gone unnoticed to anyone not looking closely. My grandfather had been watching, documenting, laying down a breadcrumb trail through time. Then I saw it, an old photograph of Karen's family property. Something about the border lines looked off. Not illegal necessarily, but wrong, deliberate, suspicious. "We need to show these to Marcus," I said, carefully setting the documents aside. "But we can't let Karen know what we found. Not yet." As if the universe had been listening, my phone buzzed on the table. A text. No name, no number. Some secrets are better left buried. I stared at the screen, heart thudding. The game had changed. The box at our feet no longer felt like just an archive of memories. It was a whispering vault of resistance. My grandfather hadn't just farmed the land. He'd prepared it, protected it, anticipated the war we were now fighting. Sarah touched my hand gently. "What's our next move?" I took a breath, letting the weight of history settle in my chest. "We prepare." The following morning, Sarah stood by the window, her face a mixture of concern and resolve. She didn't need to say anything. I knew she was wondering if we were ready. I looked across the table, now buried under decades of records. Maps, letters, county memos, environmental reports, photographs marked with red ink. This wasn't a kitchen anymore. It was a war room. The local paper, the Willowbrook Herald, had been teasing a big story all week. I knew today was the day it would break, and I knew everything would change. The phone rang. "Jack Miller here," said the voice on the line, crackling with urgency. "We're ready to run the article. Full feature. But you need to brace yourself. Karen won't take this lightly." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I'm ready." Willowbrook wasn't just a town, it was a tight web of relationships, neighbors, shared pasts, unspoken tensions. Karen Reynolds had been a fixture here for decades. She ruled with a smile and a sharpened pen. She'd silenced business owners, humiliated residents, and forced through development projects with a combination of charm and fear. But this time her tactics wouldn't work. Sarah poured coffee. Her hands were steady, but her eyes never left mine. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Not from doubt, but solidarity. I nodded. "We can't turn back now." The article hit newsstands by noon. The first phone call came minutes later. Karen, her voice sliced through the line like a razor. "You think you can humiliate me?" she hissed. "I've run this town longer than you've been breathing." "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone," I replied evenly. "I'm just protecting what belongs to my family." The line went dead. By late afternoon, coffee shops across town had become battlegrounds of whispered debate. For the first time in years, people were speaking up, sharing stories they'd never dared to tell. At the gas station, Mr. Rodriguez, the quiet man who ran the local convenience store, pulled me aside. "She tried the same trick on me a decade ago," he whispered. I didn't have the strength to fight back, but I remember. That evening, a young reporter named Emily Rodriguez appeared in front of our farm, microphone in hand. "We're here outside the Holloway property," she reported, "where a local family is accusing the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association of illegal land seizure and abuse of power. What began as a zoning dispute has now spiraled into a town-wide investigation, alleging illegal land seizure and abuse of power," the reporter concluded, her voice clear against the backdrop of our old farmhouse. Karen's response came swiftly, predictably. Within hours, she had called for an emergency HOA meeting and invited the local media. Classic damage control. But I knew her game. She didn't want resolution. She wanted the spotlight. She wanted to spin the narrative, cast me as the troublemaker trying to sow division in a peaceful community. But this time I was ready. Marcus, our attorney, arrived at the community center with a briefcase that looked like it weighed as much as our case. He glanced around the crowded room, his voice low. "They're going to come for you hard," he warned. "Be ready. Stay calm." The room buzzed with tension. Residents who once nodded obediently to Karen now sat with folded arms, brows furrowed. Something had shifted. They were watching her differently now, less like a leader, more like a suspect. Karen stood at the front of the room in a crisp blazer and sharp heels, her voice booming as she addressed the crowd. "This is nothing more than a desperate, frivolous attack," she declared. "This family is trying to derail our progress, undermine years of work." But for every word she flung into the air, I had facts to anchor us to the ground. I stepped forward and opened my folder. Property surveys dating back to 1946, tax records, agricultural maintenance logs, every document stamped, dated, and ready. The community may not have understood all the legal jargon, but they understood receipts. Sarah squeezed my hand gently. Our daughter Emma, sitting in the back, held her phone high, live streaming the meeting on social media. The community wasn't just in the room. They were watching from their phones, their homes, their coffee shops, and they were finally seeing the truth. During the break, a familiar face approached me quietly, a real estate agent I'd seen at meetings for years. "I've worked with the HOA for a long time," he murmured. "Something's always felt off. I just never had the proof, until now." By nightfall, the ripple had turned into a wave. Regional news outlets picked up the story. Property rights groups reached out. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was transforming into something much bigger, a challenge to a broken system. Karen tried one last maneuver. A courier arrived at our door with a legal notice threatening a countersuit. But it was hollow, all bark and no bite, the kind of legal scare tactic designed to make you flinch. We didn't. As the sun dipped behind the fields, painting them in a warm golden hue, I stood by the porch and stared at the hotel in the distance. That steel and glass monument to arrogance. I saw it for what it really was, a symbol of every bully who thought they could take without consequence. The phone rang. This time it wasn't local. "This is Maya Delgado, investigative journalist with State News," the woman on the line said. "We'd like to do a full feature on your story. Are you willing to go public?" I looked over at Sarah. She gave a small nod, the kind of gesture you give when you know you're past the point of fear and into the realm of action. "Yes," I said. "We're ready." What we didn't know then was just how far this would go, how deep the roots of corruption truly ran. But we were about to find out. Marcus's conference table was covered in maps and documents, layered like geological strata, each page a different decade of our family's story. My fingers traced a faded red line across one of the older maps. The creases in the paper felt like veins, alive with history. "Look here," Marcus whispered. His voice hushed, as if speaking too loud would disturb something sacred. He pointed to a faint symbol I'd missed dozens of times. It was no larger than a dot. "Wetlands, he said. I stared at him, confused. "That, he continued, is the most important mark on this map. The hotel, Karen's crown jewel, had been built directly on a federally protected ecological zone. No permits, no exemptions, no gray areas, only red tape and massive consequences. Environmental law wasn't like HOA bylaws. You didn't bend it with charm or skirt it with clever wording. It was rigid, brutal, and unforgiving. Suddenly, the countless walks I'd taken with my grandfather along those fields came rushing back. He used to point to patches of reeds, subtle soil shifts, and seasonal runoff patterns. The land speaks, he'd say. You just have to know how to listen. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. Satellite images, geological reports, water table assessments. It was overwhelming. It was perfect. We've got everything we need to bury them, he said, eyes locked on mine. But don't expect them to give up quietly. Right then, my phone buzzed. Sarah. There's an environmental group, she said, her voice quick and low. They've been monitoring this area for years. They want to meet. An ally we hadn't even asked for. Another piece falling into place. Karen's tactics, intimidation, manipulation, silence had worked for a long time. But like all unchecked power, they had a limit, and we had just found it. But power has limits, and Karen Reynolds had just run headfirst into them. Wetlands weren't abstract concepts scribbled on old maps. They were breathing ecosystems, protected by some of the strictest environmental laws in the country, laws that didn't care about HOA titles, real estate portfolios, or boutique hotel projects. Marcus paced the length of the table, outlining each potential violation. Every sentence he spoke was like a hammer blow to the HOA's carefully crafted facade. Fines ranging into 6 figures, he said. Mandatory land restoration. And if we can prove they knew about the wetlands beforehand. He didn't have to finish the sentence. I opened my phone and pulled up the photographs I'd taken over the years. Pictures of the landscape in every season. Pools of rainwater that lingered. Dense vegetation that refused to die off. Migratory birds returning to the same patch of reeds every spring. This wasn't just a hotel site, I said quietly. It was an ecosystem, and they bulldozed it. Then, as if on cue, a courier knocked at the door with another manila envelope. This one from the county's Geological Survey Department. Inside, a collection of topographic data, water table reports, and a hand-marked wetland overlay, confirming what we already suspected. Each new document was another layer of steel over our argument, and each page made it clearer. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Marcus called in a specialist from an environmental law firm. The legal jargon was intense, but the conclusion was simple. We had the makings of a bulletproof case. Then came the most unexpected development yet. My phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. Check your email, you'll want to see this. Curious, I opened it. Attached were high-resolution aerial photographs, time-stamped and geotagged. They showed the precise footprint of the wetland, right underneath Karen's hotel. The clarity was undeniable. Somewhere inside the system, someone wanted justice too. Anonymous heroes weren't just movie tropes. Sometimes they were exactly what you needed. Sarah arrived with coffee and a stack of freshly signed petition forms. Dozens of neighbors, people who had once stayed silent, had finally found their voices. One signature at a time, the HOA's grip on the community was slipping. They thought no one was paying attention, Marcus said, spreading out the aerial maps. But everyone was. They just needed someone to connect the dots. I thought of my grandfather then, how he used to talk to the land like it was alive. He never saw ownership as conquest. To him, it was stewardship, a relationship built on listening, not taking. Karen saw land as a ladder. We saw it as a legacy. The case was no longer a battle. It was a story, a quiet, undeniable story told in documents and dirt, one that said something powerful. Some things are worth more than cement and spreadsheets. And now the turning point wasn't on the horizon, it was here. My hands trembled slightly as I walked into the courtroom that morning. Not out of fear, but from the sheer weight of what this moment meant. Months of digging, researching, rebuilding, everything led here. The benches were filled, local farmers, former HOA members, curious townspeople, all of them drawn to the spectacle of a reckoning. Karen sat 2 rows ahead of us, her pristine blazer and signature pearls shining under the fluorescent lights. But there was a nervous twitch in her hand as she adjusted her designer glasses. A tiny tell. She was rattled. Marcus leaned over, calm and steady. "We've got this," he whispered. I nodded. His confidence was a lifeline I clung to. Then the judge entered. Elizabeth Hartman, stern, sharp-eyed, and famously allergic to nonsense. I saw her scan the table in front of her, stacks of documents, photos, and expert reports that Marcus had organized with surgical precision. The court will now hear closing arguments in the matter of Johnson versus the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, the bailiff announced. Marcus stood adjusting his navy suit. Your Honor, he began, this is not a simple dispute about zoning. What we have here is the deliberate exploitation of a family's land, orchestrated through loopholes, omissions, and selective enforcement. This is about power abused and legacy threatened. He stepped forward and laid out the timeline. Property maps dating back to my grandfather's ownership, preserved documents, original HOA charters with protective clauses conveniently ignored. Every document was another thread, woven into a tapestry of corruption. Karen's lawyer tried to interject, but Judge Hartman raised a hand. Let him finish, she said firmly. And just like that, the tide was ours. Karen's attorney tried to cut Marcus off mid-sentence, but Judge Hartman's icy stare froze him in place. Sit down, she said curtly. Up front, Karen's fingers began tapping against her leather portfolio. Rhythmic, unsteady, it was the first visible crack in the armor of someone who had always been unshakable. Miss Reynolds, Judge Hartman said, turning her attention to Karen directly, can you explain why your organization moved forward with hotel construction in the absence of a complete environmental impact study? Karen didn't flinch, at least not on the surface. We followed all standard procedures, she replied quickly, her tone crisp, rehearsed. The property was technically, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He handed the judge a new folder. Your Honor, here are direct communications between Miss Reynolds and local officials. Emails that strongly imply intentional avoidance of mandatory environmental reviews. In other words, backdoor dealings. Judge Hartman raised an eyebrow and began reviewing the documents silently. Each page she turned felt like another domino tipping. I remembered the night Sarah and I had first gone over those same messages, cross-referencing O's, calling in favors for metadata, chasing leads into the early hours. Every line of text in that folder had cost us something. Sleep, peace, and certainty. But it was worth it. Then came the testimony that sealed it. A local environmental scientist called to the stand, laid out the findings of her independent report. Rare species uprooted, wetland disruption, possible contamination of the underground water table. It was clinical, devastating. From my seat, I could see Karen begin to wilt. Her posture sagged. A sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. Her mouth twitched into something resembling a forced smile, but it couldn't hold. What came next shocked everyone. An HOA board member, one who had sat quietly for the entire trial, stood up and requested to speak. He approached the witness stand, visibly nervous. His hands shook. His voice wavered. I can't stay quiet anymore, he said, barely above a whisper. Karen moved forward with the hotel without a full vote from the board. Some of us opposed it. We were silenced. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even Judge Hartman paused. That moment changed everything. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. It was a moral reckoning. One by one, the layers of the HOA's corruption peeled away. Through witness statements, expert analysis, and the paper trail we had carefully unearthed. The courtroom had become a chamber of truth, and Karen couldn't stop what was coming. She sat frozen, watching everything she'd built collapse. Judge Hartman was methodical. She reviewed every document, asked precise questions, and kept her expression unreadable. A judicial poker face. Finally, with just one document left, Marcus stepped forward. Your Honor, he said, this final piece will confirm the full extent of the HOA's misconduct. Karen's lawyer objected weakly, but no one cared. Not anymore. Everyone knew this was the endgame. I walked across the fields later that evening, every step slower than the last. Not out of exhaustion, but from the weight of victory. The wind rolled over the soft soil like a sigh. The farm looked different now. Where the illegal hotel once stood, there was only broken concrete and exposed foundation. The wheat fields were starting to heal, small green blades reaching toward the sky with quiet resilience. Sarah joined me, her arm brushing mine. Together we took in the land, our land, restored. We did it, she whispered. And I nodded, though neither of us believed we were done. Not yet. Marcus had done more than win a case. He had exposed an entire system, an interconnected web of corruption, false approvals, and greedy ambition. Since the verdict, 3 city council members had resigned. Investigations were underway. Karen's empire was crumbling. They never thought a farmer would fight back, I said aloud, crouching to scoop a handful of soil. It felt different now. Not just earth, but evidence. A symbol, a promise. News outlets from across the state aired segments about our battle. Local families, inspired by our case, stepped forward with their own stories. Town halls filled with voices that once trembled, but now roared. This had never just been about property lines. It was about standing tall when no one expected you to, about refusing to be erased, about honoring legacy. My grandfather's leather-bound journals, the ones I once thought were old curiosities, had been our secret weapon. Every handwritten boundary, every scribbled note had carried more power than the modern systems that tried to override them. But Karen wasn't finished. I saw it in her eyes before she left the courtroom. She'd filed an appeal. She hinted at influential allies, at second chances. But this time we were prepared. Every move she made had a counter waiting. Because this wasn't just land anymore. It was a message that said, no one is too small to fight back. That careful documentation, family unity, and unwavering community support could overcome even the most entrenched systems of power. As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the horizon, Sarah slipped her hand into mine. "We did it," she said again, softer this time. And as a hawk circled silently above us, I smiled. Not because it was over, but because now, finally, it was beginning. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you, then join us. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and everyday heroes who refuse to be silenced. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help amplify voices that challenge corruption and protect what matters most. Your support makes all the difference.